Hello, and welcome to another episode of Global Focus, your go to podcast for in depth analysis of global events and their far reaching impacts. I am your host, and today we are honored to have a distinguished guest, Dr. Adityanjee, an expert in international relations and geopolitical strategy. Dr. Adityanjee is the president of Council for Strategic Affairs. So, as the world watches the ongoing crisis in Ukraine, many questions arise about the future of international institutions, the rule based order. How did we get there? And more importantly, what does it mean for the future of global governance? Stay with us as we delve into these crucial issues with Dr. Adityanjee. Dr. Adityanjee, welcome to the show once again.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Sinha, for inviting me again on your platform, Global Focus, and I'm very pleased to be here and hope we have a stimulating discussion.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much. So I am jumping on the first question. Is the United Nations still a credible global peacekeeping body in the wake of Ukraine conflict?
The short answer is no.
Okay.
United Nations has lost its relevance because it has been an important organization. It has been hijacked by vested interests. The way it was conceptualized for global peace, it has not been able to fulfill its mission. And parties responsible for that are the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council that have their vested interest in perpetuating their hegemony. Institution was conceptualized in the wake of end of Second World War by the victor nations, the 5 victor nations at that time: United States, Soviet Union, France, UK, and China, which was at that time Republic of China, not Communist China. So these were the veto wielding members. And the structure they contrived made General Assembly totally irrelevant because in any situation, the decisions taken by United Nations Security Council would become binding for any important issue. So for an organization that started in the wake of 1945, end of Second World War, when initially the number of countries participating in the organization was only 50, to now when there are 194 countries represented in the organization, it is no longer a representative organization. Its charter is kind of obsolete. Veto wielding powers still continue to hold the roost. There has been strong refusal to reform. And that is owing to multiple reasons. The only time the United Nations Security Council reform was in 1971 when they replaced Republic of China with Communist China and suspended Republic of China totally from the membership of the United Nations, even from General Assembly. Subsequently, there was another reform done in which, after dissolution of the Soviet Union, the United Nations Security Council appointed Russia as the successor nation. Any talk about reform of Security Council is not encouraged by the veto-wielding members, although they pay lip service to it. Since late 1990s, there have been talk about reform of Security Council. In 1945, there were 5 permanent members and 7 non-permanent members.
Yeah.
that were elected for every 2 years. Subsequently, it was changed to 5 permanent members and 10 non-permanent members. But for any decision to carry through, even if a single veto wielding power wields the veto, the resolution cannot be carried out. So we have a stalemate that in any situation, the two groups, the Western group,
Mm.
and on the opposing side, it is Russia and China. So China generally has not indulged in veto, but Soviet Union and its successor state, Russian Federation, have used the veto quite often. So has United States. So in situation of Ukraine war, the last Security Council resolution was held on February 24, 2025. That was the fourth kind of year starting of the war. And at that point in time, United States put a resolution. There were three amendments to it. Two were, I think, by European nations in the Security Council, and one was by Russia. Russian sort of amendment was not carried through. Russia vetoed the European amendments. So ultimately, the original US sponsored resolution was passed with 10 to 5 majority. Actually, what happened that 10 nations supported it. Nobody, you know, used the veto, but 5 European nations in the Security Council abstained from it. So the resolution was carried through. On the same day in General Assembly also, there were a couple of resolutions put forth, one sponsored by Ukraine, second by United States. The United States resolution was finally passed after some amendments put by the European nations. Interestingly, it was passed with 93 nations voting for it and 80 odd nations voting against it and certain nations abstaining from it. But the original US resolution was amended by the European nations. And in the end, although the amended resolution was passed by the General Assembly, United States ironically voted against its own resolution because it had been amended. So
Okay.
we are seeing very interesting permutations and combinations in which Russia and US under Trump are voting on the same side. Usually they were diametrically opposite. And
Mm.
at this point in time, European nations are having their separation from United States, which was their, sort of uh, patronage giving nation.
Yeah.
So the whole process of
Mm.
UN mechanism is stalemated. It is held hostage by the veto wielding powers in the Security Council. They don't want to give up that power and they don't want to reform. The talk of reform is only cosmetic. China keeps on putting objections to any reform on one pretext or the other. So there we are, that UN
So,
has been ineffective in stopping the Ukraine war
so
and
what?
other wars prior to that.
Okay. So, what alternative global governance mechanisms could replace or complement the UN? What do you say about it?
So I think the talk about global governance is a myth or a utopia. The so-called rule-based order is again a myth created by the Western imperialist nations, because ultimately what happens is what the powerful superpowers want. And you have seen it, uh, the way UN is functioning, it might achieve the fate of the League of Nations that was formed after First World War and folded fairly soon because US was not willing to be party to it. And the way under Trump 2 administration, US is trying to withdraw from UN institutions tells you that US is not concerned about United Nations. US is going to bypass all the international organizations and assert and establish its own hegemony, either bilaterally or plurilaterally with the smaller countries. So I don't see any chance of a viable mechanism to replace United Nations at this point in time till the attitudes of superpowers change. There are some multilateral organizations, but they don't have the sort of power that a large organization like United Nations carries. So you have, multilateral mechanisms, but these are not universally acceptable. They do not have universal kind of appeal and membership. You have, like, for economic matters, G20, which is now G21, with African Union being part of it.
Yeah.
But most of these things are recommendations. There's no enforcement mechanism. There are, like, for climate issues, the you know, uh, COP conferences that happen, that is, countries that have concern about it. But again, US is withdrawing from, the Paris climate meeting and all. So US has invoked the doctrine of exceptionalism, American exceptionalism, that they are not bound by any of these treaties or obligations, for that matter, UNCLOS, the United Nations Law of Seas. US signed but failed to sort of ratify it.
Okay.
Similarly, there were other things, CTBT, United Nations, US signed it but failed to ratify. So, no global governance institution can become functional if the largest superpower refuses to follow the rules.
So, how has the Ukraine war exposed the fractures in the global order?
Please repeat the question.
How has the Ukraine war exposed the fractures in the global order?
Not just Ukraine war, I will tell you that United Nations not only is dysfunctional, it's also very corrupt organization. So you saw that after the first Iraq war,
Yeah.
sanctions were placed on Iraq. It was not allowed to sell the oil under sanctions, United Nations sanctions. Uh, and what happened that there was starvation of children and population. So ultimately, UN created a mechanism that was oil for food program, under which Iraq under Saddam Hussein was able to sell some of the oil for importing essential goods and food uh, under a committee. And that committee was headed by a UN bureaucrat who came from Cyprus. His name was Benon Sevan. And there was so much of corruption that ultimately this guy had to resign and went back to Cyprus. And they found that he had been bribed by a tune of $125,000, which were found in his bank account in Cyprus. Also, Saddam Hussein used that program to get kickbacks from the companies that were allowed to supply, essential items. So almost $1.5 billion was used up by Saddam Hussein by taking kickbacks. And some of the vouchers for oil were given as, like, bribes to various entities. You would be surprised that in Indian context, Congress Party and Natwar Singh, who was once upon a time foreign minister, although they were in a position, they managed to travel to Iraq, talk to Saddam Hussein along with a IFS officer, Ambassador Mathurani. And Natwar Singh actually took Mathurani as well as his own son Jagat Singh. And vouchers for oil were allocated to Congress Party and Natwar Singh's son to the tune of, I think, 8 million barrels of oil. It created a lot of noise. Congress Party was forced to suspend Natwar Singh, but they never explained why did they, get those oil vouchers and what did they do with it, and who was the ultimate beneficiary. Similarly, there have been corruptions in United Nations peacekeeping force
Yeah.
maintenance, and countries that have, contributed troops in UN peacekeeping mechanism, they are themselves, culprits in human rights violations. So there are a lot of problems historically, not just because of Ukraine war. This is an ineffective mechanism. And you now see a different kind of, alliances and geopolitical combinations coming up. Traditionally, as I said, that the Western countries, Western bloc was on one side, and so-called Soviet Union or Communist bloc was on the other side. Now it is not so simple because United States has a slow divorce from the European countries. So UN is coming as one pole and sort of voting along with Russia. And
Mhm.
then European countries are going in a different direction. So you are seeing interesting times where even in Security Council you will have different, multi-polar situation. So European countries that involve two veto building members, actually France and UK, they voting along with other European countries that are non-permanent members, and United States and Russian Federation voting side by side with other members of the UN Security Council. So it's an interesting situation at this point in time, and I think any conflict will be now decided not by United Nations, but whoever is the dominant power.
So, has the Ukraine conflict accelerated the decline of the US led global order? Can you throw some light on it?
The global order has already started to change, and you are seeing relative decline of both Russian Federation as well as United States. United States has been declining for because of its own issues. Uh, it has printed so many dollars, and it is under so much of debt, external debt, almost $37 trillion of debt, whereas its estimated GDP at this point in time in 2025 would be around $30 trillion. So you keep on printing dollars because you have the right to do so. You are the dominant superpower. Uh, but this is not sustainable. Russian Federation is also declining economically because last 3 years of war
Mhm.
have had its consequences. Russia is a large commodity rich country, and they have been able to continue to sell their commodities, mainly oil and gas, although at a discounted price. But without going into Russian figures, some people are saying that Russia may have lost maybe 700,000 soldiers, either killed or seriously wounded. Even if that is an exaggeration, they have lost hundreds of thousands of young men, to the extent that they had to invite North Korean soldiers
Yeah.
to fight the battle. And there were reports that they were recruiting people from other third world countries, ostensibly for support staff. But those were forced to go and fight on the battlefield as combatants. And some of these unfortunate people were from India and Nepal, and some of them did get killed. Similarly, on Ukraine side, there were mercenaries. Everyone knew those mercenaries. And there is some talk that active duty US personnel were involved and are still involved, and they may be as many as 20,000 active duty US personnel either on the battlefield in Ukraine or in the neighboring countries providing support. And foreign mercenaries, retired veterans from US, from UK, from other European countries were already fighting there in Ukraine. So ultimately, what is happening there that because of this war, the two major powers, Russia as well as the United States, are declining because US has put almost $350 billion in this war. And Trump administration now realizes that it is not sustainable. So they are withdrawing. They will stop giving intelligence inputs to Ukrainian forces. And they are saying that we are not going to provide any more equipment. The war needs to come to an end, which is understandable. War needs to come to an end. But the result of 3 year plus long war is gradual weakening of the two major powers.
That should have happened.
It's happening. It's happening under our own eyes. Probably the only beneficiary of this war is China.
Yeah. So, can the United Nations remain neutral in an increasingly polarized world?
Kindly repeat your question.
Can the United Nations remain neutral in an increasingly polarized world?
Look, how does United Nations remain quote unquote neutral? They are not able to stop the war. General Assembly is impotent. Security Council is stalemated because of the veto threats from Russia. Both Ukraine as well as European powers are saying that Russian Federation is misusing its veto, but the rules allow it. Either you change the rules. When there was a time to change the rule and bring reform, nobody was interested in. Veto power is the relic of colonial world,
Yeah.
but nobody wanted to reform it. And whenever there is a talk of reform of UN Security Council, the 5 permanent members don't want to give their veto power. And any talk of having extra permanent member, they want to create another category, non-veto holding permanent members. So, in other words, you want to create more divisions, more hierarchy, and
Yeah.
continue to maintain your own hegemony based on 1945 Victor situation.
Yeah.
UN is no longer at least the Security Council is no longer a sort of representative body. And some of the organizations of UN have been hijacked by vested interests. So if you see UNHCR, the human rights, it has been taken over by certain nations that kind of support terrorism. A group of countries, by sheer virtue of their numbers, have taken over. So any rhetoric coming from that Human Rights Council or its successor is tinged with that kind of language. Look at World Health Organization. It has been for 20 years hijacked by China because China keeps on paying money to the potential candidates who fight elections. Where was WHO during COVID pandemic? It was busy whitewashing Chinese role in spread of this Wuhan virus and was trying to deflect attention from China's potential role in creating this virus in the lab and spreading it all over the world. So, in nutshell, all the institutions of United Nations are totally corrupt or dysfunctional. And the responsibility lies on the Second World War victorious powers as to how they, you know, dealt with this situation.
So should regional organizations like BRICS, the ASEAN, SCO take on more responsibility in maintaining global stability?
These organizations have their own charters and roles, but they cannot be governing institutions. They are multilateral cooperative institutions, but they cannot enforce their will. What do you think? BRICS can enforce its will on United States? US is already saying that they will put 100% tariffs on all the BRICS countries if they bring a BRICS currency. Of course, personally, I don't support the idea of a BRICS currency, but what right does United States have to put 100% tariffs and penalize countries that are member states of BRICS? Similarly, SCO it's a China-dominated institution. The only sort of, reliable or authentic institutions are like G20. But G20 again is only in the economic sphere. It cannot bring about peace. It cannot enforce peace. That role is given to United Nations Security Council, and if it does not get its act together, wars will continue to happen.
So what are the possible futures for global governments beyond UN?
I think UN, because of its inertia, inactivity, and impotence, needs to be gutted down. And based on the reality of today's world, a new institution needs to be created. Now, that's a tall order. It's not going to happen. So, in next few years, conceivably in next few years, we will continue to see a dysfunctional UN and same kind of dysfunction continuing in global governance. The only international rule in the rule-based order is quote unquote might is right. You have the United States wanting to annex Canada as its 51st state by bringing economic coercion, taking over Greenland from Denmark, taking over Panama Canal by force, by hook or by crook. You have situation where if these things were to happen, China will take the advantage and will take over Taiwan, and US will not do anything because it's not in their interest to get into a war with China. So you will have dominant countries, colonizing the region.
So India will also do something in that case if those things happen.
Well, that would depend upon government of India. How brave is that? And how it enforces its own will in its near abroad and take care of its own interests if that were to happen.
So the decline of a UN is inevitable. So do you think can it be salvaged through reforms, and do you see any chance of the reforms happening in UN?
The possibility of reform is there, but I don't see any chances of that happening. Unless they bring India as the major power, as a permanent member in the Security Council. You have two European countries that have lost their relevance. Why should they be permanent members? Why can't you just grant European Union as a seat as a permanent member? Why can't you grant India a seat as a permanent member? And why can't you give, let's say, African Union a seat as a permanent member rather than trying to pick South Africa versus Nigeria or whatever? But the current structure will not reform because the way things are, the current members don't want reform because their own powers will be curtailed. So yes, there can be several mechanisms by which you don't want to make Security Council so unwieldy with multiple categories of members, 3 or 4 grades of members. 2 is fine, but I think the veto has to go and permanent members need to be enlarged.
So,
Until that is done, and it has to be representative of the world population.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Cannot continue to keep India out.
yeah. So I think this is the most important question from me. What would be a more balanced and effective global government system look like?
Look, we have gone over this over and over again. I don't see any possibility of any global governance. I think that's a utopian rhetoric. If you see history, it's the dominant powers that have ruled the roost, and that is what is happening. All these utopian rhetorics do not change the power calculations. And this is why you are seeing this inertia, impasse, quagmire, because the dominant powers are not willing to concede their interests. Ultimately, Westphalian states will continue to pursue their own interests, and there will be some rhetoric on some issues about quote unquote rule based order and global governance, but there's no global governance. We can be hypocritical in talking about global governance, but no nation is going to yield sovereignty.
So even the regional alliances have no relevance here in managing the global conflicts.
Regional alliances can be effective only if their constituents are involved in some kind of conflict and there's no outside party. And regional alliances are questioned, their relevance is questioned, their jurisdiction is questioned. Who is going to give right to SCO, to control Central Asia? Just answer that question.
Yeah.
Who is going to give rights to BRICS to manage the affairs in those countries? Will United States do? The United States has already said that they are going to put tariffs.
Okay, so that was all the question I had for you today, sir. So friends, that's all for today's episode of Global Focus. We hope you found this discussion enlightening and thought-provoking. A huge thank you to you, Dr. Adityanjee, for sharing your invaluable insight with us.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Sinha. The lasting comment I'll make is that we are heading towards a global trade war where tariffs and counter tariffs are going to be used, and World Trade Organization is going to be made totally ineffective, and that trade war may be followed by some regional wars or conflicts because United States is giving threats to acquire more territory by use of force or economic coercion. And that will have consequences because it will give carte blanche to other countries to do whatever they want to do in their own backyard.
So that is another potential topic I wanted to discuss with you, the tariff war, how it unfolds. You think it will unfold and what India saw at this juncture, how India should play this. So that is actually a very potential topic that we should discuss.
And I will be happy to sit with you to discuss that at some other time. Thank you very much.
Yes, so friends, don't forget to subscribe to our podcast for more expert analysis and of the critical events and shaping our world. Until next time, stay informed and stay engaged. Thank you so much. So thank you so much, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Sinha. And thank you to Global Focus for providing this platform for discussion.